Well, it's top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'd like to welcome you today to on behalf of all the members of the Gerontological Society of America's Emerging Scholar and Professional Organization Webinar Task Force. We'd like to welcome you to the webinar entitled Addressing Issues of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion on the Job Market, Considerations for Job Applications, Interviews, and Presentations. The webinar has been supported by the Gerontological Society of America Innovation Fund. My name is Kristen Lavoie, and I will be serving as your moderator today. To provide you a bit of my background, I am a newly appointed assistant professor at the Indiana University School of Nursing, with a joint appointment as a research scientist for the Center for Aging Research at Regan Streif Institute. Additionally, I have the pleasure of being a member of the ESPO Webinar Task Force. Having been on the job market this past year, I'm delighted to be sharing some of my experiences and insights with you today. Next slide. So as we did in our spring webinar series, we'd first like to set the stage for this webinar by saying that on today's agenda, our experts will discuss insights on how to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the job market. We do recognize that these are difficult and often uncomfortable conversations that might bring up many emotions. Please know that we want to create a safe and brave space for this discussion. Our intention is to educate and learn, and not to further oppress or cause distress. Please feel free to reach out to a mental health professional if you feel triggered and need help. Next slide. So to orient you to today's webinar, we would like to inform you that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on GSA's website. A notice to all attendees will be distributed once the recording is available. We also invite you to use the chat feature of the webinar platform to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to try to address all those questions during the Q&A session. Also, please use the two drop-down boxes at the top of the webinar platform to adjust your presentation view as you desire. Next slide. So the webinar is divided into 4 sections today. We will begin with introductory comments from our 2 panelists, followed by moderator comments. We will then turn back to the panelists to respond to the moderator comments and complete the webinar with a Q&A session. Next slide. So before we begin today, as we were thinking about addressing issues of DEI on the job market, we also want to keep in mind the DEI issues that are of particular significance to the older adult population that we collectively serve. As you may already know, GSA has been actively involved in the Reframing Aging initiative, which aims to address the entrenched ageism in American society. As GSA's CEO, James Appleby, states, this initiative constitutes ongoing work to cultivate a new way of talking about aging that leads to greater support of age-friendly programs and policies, and creates a health system, public health infrastructure, and community ecosystems that foster health equity. On one of the 4 ways they are garnering support for this call to action is through engaging with practice, education, and research communities. So in this way, we are all reframing agents in the work that we're doing. Next slide. So now I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Their full bios have been previously distributed in the promotional flyer, and it's also attached as a handout on the webinar platform. First, we have Dr. Sheldon Fields. He is a research professor and associate dean for equity and inclusion in the College of Nursing at Penn State University. He is also founder and CEO of the SDF Group, LLC, which is a health innovation consultant company. He has 30 years of experience in the health sector as an educator, researcher, clinician, administrator, consultant, health policy specialist, and entrepreneur and business owner. Dr. Fields is a well-known and respected HIV/AIDS prevention research scientist. He is a lifetime member of the National Black Nurses Association and currently serves as the organization's National First Vice President. Through a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellowship Program, Dr. Fields also served as a policy advisor to Senator Barbara Mikulski on the Senate Health Committee during the historic healthcare reform debates and passage of the Affordable Care Act. Dr. Fields is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, the American Association of Nurse Practitioners, and the National Academies of Practice. Dr. Deidre Hill Butler is an associate professor of sociology at Union College. Dr. Hill Butler's research area encompasses the sociology of Black women's resilience and joy. Her current focus is the role of African American women in contemporary step families. Dr. Hill Butler's diversity, equity, and inclusion work in higher education and community organizations spans 30 years. She's part of the inaugural diversity team at Union College, and she is the Director of Faculty Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, Academic Diversity Officer. She's a lifetime member of the Association of Black Women Historians and contributed an article to their organization's 2008 text, Emerging Voices and Paradigms. She has also served as the guest editor for an Africana mothering-themed edition of the Journal of Pan-African Studies. Welcome, Dr. Fields and Dr. Butler. Next slide. So to prime our discussion, we'd first like to get your initial thoughts, Dr. Fields and Dr. Hill Butler, on the following questions. We'd like to reserve about 5 minutes each for your initial reflections. And the two questions that we're contemplating to start our webinar off are, what are the one or two things candidates should be considering when addressing issues of DEI on the job market? And second, considering your institutional role, what are you specifically looking for in a candidate? And Dr. Hill Butler, we could, if you don't mind, starting us off.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm heard, correct? You're having some technical issues. I'm at a predominantly white institution, liberal arts, small liberal arts college, and there's an initiative now, well, it's been long-standing, but an initiative to try to expand the ranks of faculty who come from diverse backgrounds. So what we're looking for, or what the theme is, mostly is for people to come who are well researched, are open to innovative teaching strategies, who are open to sharing their research skills. And a key thing is for candidates, what I wish I was told before I got on the market eons ago was to maintain your authentic self. Don't quiet that. And I had to grow in that throughout my career, through strong mentorship on my campus and through professional associations like this, to be more affirmed. You join a place or choose to work at a place where you feel like you can bloom professionally. And the institutions, you have to see markers in place at the institutions that you are applying to work for, that show that they are ready for you to be there. And that then those key things is that they have maybe deans or department chairs who understand and are knowledgeable about the literature and the background of information of how to grow our faculty and to grow a supportive environment that's one of belonging for everyone that's involved in that campus community. And so my role here is to be one of the team members to do that. So in part, it's like I'm doing things that I wish had been done for me in a lot of ways, trying to make the institution more aware of the complex issues of having faculty members come from with skills and highly qualified are here to keep thriving and doing well.
Wonderful. And you mentioned, Dr. Hill Butler, these innovative teaching strategies, and that you guys are really targeting folks that have some thoughts on that. Could you provide a few examples for our members?
Right. To make sure there are faculty development resources there that keep you, that allow for you to keep growing your skills in your research, adequate funding, adequate to set up your labs, to do your work, adequate ongoing teaching and learning initiatives. So you're learning how to stay up on the latest ways in which educational trends are going. Having those resources available um, as, and having that being ongoing, not just a one-time thing, that helps you grow and foster. And if you are in a tenure track position, position you for promotions and retention.
So that's really great reflections on just how you feel supported in your new role and the opportunities for you to grow professionally. Dr. Fields, if you take a few minutes to reflect on these questions as well.
Sure. First of all, good morning, Dr. Lavoie, and thank you to GSA for the wonderful opportunity to be a part of this presentation today. So in addressing your first question about one or two key things that a candidate, should be aware of when addressing DEI issues on the job market, I'll start with one that I don't think a lot of people truly think about. And one should always be aware of what your DEI, social media, and public footprint is. Let me explain about what I mean. So, there's a lot going on in our world today, and we're addressing each other over social media more and more. A lot of us, we've been trapped at home, so this was our outlet. And there are certain things that, people have been very opinionated about. And I'm not saying that one should not be opinionated or voice one's opinion. What I'm saying is be aware of what you have put out into the universe. Because one, social media is forever. You may delete something on LinkedIn or Instagram or, whatever platform you're using, but people can discover it. And before you even step foot in front of a search committee, they're going to Google you. And if you haven't Googled yourself and seen what's out there, they'll do it for you. So, and what do I mean by that is, something really ticked you off and you had a verbal explosion on Facebook. And again, you're entitled to your opinion, but people can take those things and put them out of context. And then you wind up having to explain. So don't put yourself in that position. The other thing too is really understand the type of institution that you are applying to and how does your personal DEI sense or definitions and even your place in the world fit within that bigger institution. Dr. Butler mentioned the type of institution that she's at. Well, we're Penn State, and we are a internationally world-renowned Research One institution. We are big. We have the largest living alumni base of any university in the country. So understand who we are before you come to us as an institution. And in terms of my role specifically, so I'm the inaugural Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion in what is now the Ross and Carol Neitz College of Nursing here at Penn State. So again, we're Research One. We have all types of programs. So from my standpoint, when I am helping my college specifically to look at candidates from my role, it is all about what it is that you bring to the table that will enhance our mission and vision. It's a huge consideration. And again, if we're hiring people as faculty, you have to understand or be able to articulate how does your research, both past, present, and future, fit into what it is we are trying to do here. And one of the things is you always need to be aware of the current events of the institution. I'll give you a really good example. If you're applying to here at Penn State, then you should also be aware that on this very morning, we announced the formation of a brand new Center for Racial Justice at the institution. This is going to cut across our entire institution. And since we're talking about the job market, guess what? We are going to launch a national search for the director of that center. So be lookout for some job openings.
That's great. Nice plug. I also really love your reflection on that social media and public footprint, and really being aware of what you're putting out into the world, and being aware of sort of emerging institutional developments and current events at where you're applying. Dr. Hill-Butler, I saw you writing notes. I didn't know if you had any other additional opening responses.
No, I don't have any specific job postings to claim here, but I agree with understanding the temperature of the school. You know, like I said, a small liberal arts college is very different from a huge research one institution with different goals and parameters. And I think even with both institutions or types of institutions, there's there's a certain image, and there's information that's plainly stated, but there's also hidden agendas that are happening. And so understanding your social footprint, that you're being looked at for what you present and what you give as part of your file for being a part of the career or that institution, but also just knowing and being aware that everything follows you. Your background follows you in multiple ways. And I also think it's really key to find key mentors or advocates for yourself on this journey, no matter where you land, and trying to fostering that. And that's a huge part of what I consider a DEI B, with belonging sense, that you have people that you can trust to talk through the different choices that are made throughout your career, and to help you navigate to understand if that institution is the correct space for you, and if that culture is a good fit. It may take a few years being at that institution to figure that out, but always keeping solid mentors or advocates. They may be your professors from graduate school or colleagues from your graduate experience or your workplace experiences. It's always good to keep solid, positive relationships that help you navigate whichever environment you tend to land.
Wonderful. So some really great opening thoughts. We'll take the next 10 minutes or so, if we can proceed to the next slide, and thinking about some sort of takeaways and tips for our ESPO members as they are approaching the different components of the job interview process. And after that, we'll have you guys provide some more reflection on that. So in preparing for this webinar, our task force really reached out to colleagues who had recently been on the job market to gain their insights into how they addressed issues of DEI in job applications, interviews, and presentations. And our colleagues shared a multitude of resources, including their diversity statements, approaches to interview preparation, sample job market presentations, as well as other references. And so we kept these documents confidential, but we went through them to try to identify some themes that were emerging from those different components of the interview process. And so really these recommendations and tips and takeaways that we're presenting today are a collective, they're an aggregation of multiple experiences, recent experiences on the job market in 2020. And these recommendations aren't meant to be prescriptive, but really to provide a starting point for your own personal reflection and preparation. So we'll start off with the DEI and job applications, and we can go to the next slide. This really typically, for most candidates that we spoke to, involved writing a diversity statement. And if a diversity statement was not explicitly requested, typically the institutions were requesting you to speak to DEI in the cover letter that accompanied your application. And even if the institution isn't asking for those things, I think some of these pieces may be helpful in just thinking about preparing for interview questions. So the general sort of arc of the diversity statements, as we looked across the different ones that we reviewed, was an opening section with personal describing personal experiences with DEI, a middle section that talks about their current reflections on DEI, and then a conclusion with future directions. And we'll get into those pieces a little bit now. So next slide. In the opener of the diversity statements, we typically saw candidates were describing personal experiences in terms of one's gender, race, ethnicity, sexual identity or orientation, and or their socioeconomic status. And candidates specifically recounted stories that they had experienced with implicit bias, stereotyping, discrimination, marginalization, and outright racism with respect to these individual or intersectionality of these identities. And when candidates chose not to get that personal, sometimes they were reflecting on their own core beliefs and values related to DEI and potentially how those beliefs and values were rooted in their upbringing. And the other version of this came in the form of personal reactions to recent societal events and movements like the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movement. So after that opening section, if we can proceed to the next slide, then typically the diversity statements, the next section really reflected on how that opening content has shaped the candidate's educational or career path and currently influences the candidate's clinical research or teaching practice. And then the final concluding piece is really future directions of DEI. Next slide. And thinking about how those personal experiences are really going to shape the next stages of their career. And typically that was candidates really reaffirming their commitment to work in DEI, whether that took the form of DEI in research, teaching, service, clinical practice, and or mentoring. Right, next slide. So talking to some of our colleagues about the job interviews, the climate of 2020 has really prompted many institutions, and Dr. Fields and Dr. Butler mentioned this as well, is really to reflect and reevaluate their approaches to DEI and using this period of time to really revise, update, and embed DEI principles more fully into the fabric of what they do. And so really, when we were talking to our colleagues about interview preparation, then really the take-home message, and Dr. Fields touched on this as well, is encouraging you to do your homework on the institution prior to the interview. And we just looked ourselves and got some advice from our colleagues, next slide, of potential areas of an institution's website that you may think about looking at as you're preparing for these interviews. And I think, most people naturally think to go to the mission, vision, and values statement, but you'll find there's a lot more information on these websites than used to be there. There's new DEI statements. Some institutions are developing strategic plans specifically around DEI. You can download those strategic plans and look at what their future directions are and how your work may be feeding into those strategic institutional goals. We also found principles of inclusion on some websites, anti-racism pledges. They were often advertising coursework, workshops, or continuing education opportunities. You may also look at other faculty profiles and try to understand what kind of disparities-focused research is happening at that institution, not just within the potential school that you may be applying, but across the university. Any research centers with a DEI or disparities focus. And also thinking about, and I think this speaks to Dr. Butler's sort of knowing the temperature of the institution, and really what kind of institution it is, as well as the community that it serves, and what's in the surrounding communities, and a lot of the research and activities that are going on at those universities ultimately feed back into those in the surrounding communities. So these are just some potential things to think about when you're preparing for interview questions. Next slide. And really the reason for this homework is that most institutions ask some version of the following question. In terms of the institution's research, teaching, service, and or practice mission, discuss how you have or will emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own work. Some colleagues also mentioned that they were really interested in questions surrounding handling hot topics if you're in an educational role, how you would navigate those issues in the classroom. And I think it's important to remember that really not forgetting that interview questions are a two-way street, and so come prepared to answer questions as well as to ask questions that may be specific to your role. So for example, and I think Dr. Butler and Dr. Field's opening statements also alluded to this, is you really want to ask about ways in which you're going to feel supported with respect to DEI and what they will do to help you succeed in your new role. Next slide. So looking at presentation tips, if you're asked to do a job market presentation, you're often asked to reflect on how DEI is or will be embedded into your research, teaching, and or practice missions. And we encourage you to sort of reflect on those things and then thread those throughout your presentations. Next slide. Relevant to your own research, this is a framework I came across in my own job talk preparation. At the time I was on the job market, I had recently attended a workshop where Dr. Elise Park, she's a professor of psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and she presented her disparities research. And in doing that, she described a framework that she and her colleagues have used to think about how research may be used to address disparities issues at various levels. And Dr. Park and her colleagues have really adapted public health's framework for primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, and really sort of adapted those levels to disparities work. So when you think about disparities work, you can maybe think about how your research might deal with issues of DEI at a primary, secondary, or tertiary level. And I'll give you some examples. So research at a primary level, primary access level, so that macro level is really thinking about if your research addresses helping individuals or populations gain access to the healthcare system. And then secondary access, research dealing with this may be helping individuals or populations navigate within the healthcare system. And at the tertiary level, and this is more micro level, is looking at research that addresses challenges in the clinical interactions. And you know, when I was preparing for the job market, I always thought about DEI at more of these macro levels, and my work is around a lot of communication and how we improve serious illness communication for those facing chronic life-limiting illnesses. And I hadn't really thought about this more macro level of how disparities manifest even in these clinical interactions, and how some of my work may be uncovering some of those things. So this may be a good framework in organizing your thoughts, and how does it describe how your work does dovetail with DEI issues at either that more macro or micro level. And next slide. And in terms of teaching, I think a part of addressing structural racism and systemic inequality and discrimination starts with how we are training those in the healthcare field and those that serve the older adult community. So relevant to teaching, you may want to spend some time thinking about the type of learning environment, teaching materials, and teaching strategies that you will use. So with respect to the environment, you may want to think about how you plan to create an environment that fosters expression of diverse perspectives. This could include becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, being humble, authentic, self-aware of your own implicit or explicit biases, showing humility, having a statement about ground rules for class interactions in your syllabus. And then your course materials should really echo the kind of learning environment you want to foster, staying mindful of selecting diverse course readings, case studies that reflect diversity, and potentially including your own DEI statement in your syllabus. And then you may also want to think about being armed with some sort of knowledge around teaching strategies that will help you facilitate rich discussions and how to handle hot topics when they arise. And even if you're not teaching in an academic setting, some of this may be helpful in other community-based settings. And one of the frameworks I came across during the interview process was something called the HEALS framework that some institutions are using to help faculty address exclusionary, objectionable, or intimidating behavior. And the acronym stands for H, for halting the discussion, E, engaging with the issue, A, allowing exchange of opinions, L, learning to listen to one another, and S, synthesizing to reflect on the issues and what has been discussed. So it's naming the issue, opening up for conversation and talking about it. And there's some trainings that you can do relevant to this particular strategy. And we've provided those links later on, and I'll reference those in the slides at the end of the presentation. So we have some links to more information about the HEALS framework, as well as other strategies and resources that our colleagues provided us when we were preparing for the webinar. So if you find those helpful in preparing your own materials for the interview process, feel free to access this recording later on the GSA website, and those will be there for you. And I really, in thinking about sort of DEI and teaching, I also really liked this quote from the American Association of Colleges of Nursing. And they really drive sort of standards and quality education of nurses. And it says, when diversity is integrated within inclusive educational environments with equitable systems in place, biases are examined, assumptions are challenged, critical conversations are engaged, perspectives are broadened, civil readiness and engagement are enhanced, and socialization occurs. So I really sort of encourage you to sort of think about what your own personal sort of philosophy is of teaching, and how some of your own personal convictions may fit in with some of these DEI approaches to teaching. Next slide. So this is sort of our, again, collective amalgamation of just sort of lived experience on the job market over the last year, and sort of thinking about what was helpful to us. I think a lot of us had never written a diversity statement before. We weren't really sure where to start. And so we've sort of collected all this information, hopefully to provide some useful tips to our ESPO members. But we're really curious in and your feedback, Dr. Hill-Butler and Dr. Fields, if we can go to the next slide. And we'll start with the first question here and move to the second one in a minute. Reflecting on the tools that we've sort of put together with respect to DEI on the job market, are there gaps in what has been presented, or anything further you would add or underscore for our members? And Dr. Fields, we can start with you this time.
Okay, so one, those were really great tips, and I really like the HEAL model as well as the AACN statement. So one of the things that I think people do is they get nervous about this topic. And I really liked what Dr. Butler started with being your authentic self. Because if you're trying to speak to issues that you really don't believe in or using terminology that you yourself have never reflected on, those of us who do this work and have done this work, because I want to be really clear about something. Before DEI became fashionable, before it became a hallmark, or before it became something that people really started to be intentional about paying attention to. There are those of us who have been living this. So before I was doing DEI work, I lived DEI work as a Black man in America, more specifically as a nurse, a Black man who is a nurse with some very unique experiences of my own. So I know what I'm also bringing to the table and what's playing sort of in my background, if you will. And I say that to say this. I have really good detectors, and I can pick up when someone is being inauthentic. So don't try to play the search committee, and don't try to play folks who do this for a living. And I think that's the kindest way I can say that. You know, if you don't know something, admit you don't know. Admit what your own experiences have been, because that tells me, as someone sitting on the other side, that you are at least aware of where you are first. Because if you have no personal awareness and no personal reflection, I can't teach you. It's so much more difficult. So do start there first, and I really just wanted to underscore that. So I'll start with that first reflection, and I'll let Dr. Butler give hers.
You can keep going. I was enjoying it because you're in the amen corner over here. Yes, before all this became vogue and intentional, we've been out there doing the work. Just from a personal standpoint, I'm at, like I said, a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, and I'm the first Black woman tenured at my school. And this is the oldest school in New York State. I just let that sit there. You know, we're in 2021, and this is so, and that happened in 2009 about earning tenure. So there's what do I say? I say this: look for the clues and interview the institutions. Well, it was said during Dr. Lavoie's comments. Well, they're interviewing you, but you need to interview them. And the skills that you're bringing and the expertise that you're bringing forth, they have to be ready for that. So really looking at the DEI statements that are created. My institution, we just crafted our first institutional DEIB statement last year. And we're in the process of having departments crafting statements and working with their professional associations for support. And their particular faculty members, I conduct workshops on how to not just have a statement, but you're living the statement. Do you have people of color on in your syllabi? Are you addressing issues of inequity in all the different disciplines, not just in the social sciences? If you're in a physics class, are you encountering other physicists who aren't male and aren't of Caucasian background in your work? And where is LGBTQIA colleagues in their research in your discipline, in your field, in medieval history and other areas? So the work is there. Do the work and show that. The students can read that, and your colleagues do too. And I think education needs to make that perspective plain. I too like the HEALS framework and conduct workshops to inform or to learn from my colleagues who are engaging in topics that are new to them. And I think we all just need to step into a brave space. So it behooves all of us to work at institutions that want to be brave and encounter. The demographics show that we need to address and retain and help the whole college community and the communities we serve and we are located in to appreciate and value each other. And so showing that in your lesson plans and your execution and in the research that you conduct is really key.
That's great. I love that, making sure that not only that they have a statement, but they're living it. It's such a great point. Our next question, and Dr. Fields, I think you already answered it, is, can you share some examples of disappointing responses to DEI questions that you've encountered during the interview process, and how you could have improved it? And I know, Dr. Fields, you've already spoke with just the need to being authentic and honest about what you do and don't know, and self-aware. Would you have anything to add to that?
Oh, absolutely. So, it's very clear, again, that one should be anticipating to address these topics and issues. So a response that comes off as a surprise, or a response that comes off as with a sense that one is annoyed of being even asked the question. So be very aware of your tone, be very aware of, how you are showing up, your body language, even your use of silence. Even in your silence, do you speak? One cannot not communicate. Basic tenet of communication. The other thing, and you should be excited about answering this question, because you should really have a sense of where you are. You also should not be using any type of language that could be misconstrued as inflammatory. So what do I mean by that? Overuse of gendered terminology and gendered pronouns, not being respectful, the lack of awareness of current terminology, even basic things that you may not necessarily fully appreciate. I read an article where, even the terminology about how to talk about students, because in your response, you might be addressing how your work would address students. So we no longer call, students freshmen because it has gender terminology. So we talk about students having a first year experience, because, so even those basic types of things, if you're addressing a committee and someone has specifically said to you, what their pronouns are, but you only insist on using binary terms, and really center yourself as his and her. And we do that a lot, specifically in nursing, because nursing is traditionally an overwhelmingly female profession. However, it's not always the case. So just be aware, and how things like that can be improved is be up to date. Show that you have really put a little bit of work into this. There's so many resources out there now that, to make these type of faux pas, which might be innocent, but may come across as being just willfully ignorant, could really cost you a job.
Wow. Yeah. Dr. Butler, do you have any sort of experiences with disappointing responses you'd like to share?
Yes, I think being an accomplice in this work is really important. So a part of being your authentic self is realizing what you don't know, and then taking the energy to learn more about it. So there are resources in the workplace because the growth of DEI and DEIB work in most professional settings, there's workshops, seminars, to review the notes from this seminar, just to learn about the pronouns, to understand why that's important, that people usually have their pronouns on Zoom calls. We don't have that today, but usually on Zoom calls you have your pronouns there. Just doing that work, so you become comfortable being uncomfortable and realizing the more that you know, that you think you know, that you don't know. You keep doing that. I'm continually participating in workshops and reading, and in the process of writing and doing my research, constantly learning, because there are so many voices and experiences that need to be understood, especially as healthcare providers. The populations you'll be serving and working with may be very different from you, but all people, regardless of background, deserve respect and understanding, and so that's at the foundation of what we're doing, understanding each other. It takes time. Going back to an earlier question, at this institution, we do require DEIB statements. So this is very important in all applications. You're asked that. So just to know and anticipate that you should talk about working with other people, team mentality, being respectful of others. That's coming, and that should be shown in the statement and in your presentation, the work that you give.
Yeah, one of the things that I will say to applicants: talk about DEI in whatever way you are going to do it as a process and not an endpoint. I really want to underscore that, because, and I'm quite sure Dr. Butler would agree, it is a process. We are all ever evolving. And if it's a process, that means there's movement, there's in and out, there is room for growth. But if you talk about it as absolutes and endpoints and something that once you get to, you think you've arrived, no. Then you're missing so many things about what is not only an ever evolving issue, but no one can really know it all. So don't pretend that you do.
Great. Such amazing reflections. If we can go to the next slide. And if you guys have any questions, we're approaching time for the Q&A session. So if there are any audience questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll pause and shift to those as they come in. So the next question that we wanted to get your reflections on was, what questions should our ESPO members be asking recruiting committees about DEI in the interview? And I think we've mentioned some of these aspects before, but again, anything you would highlight there?
I'll jump in. Ask about the organization's strategic plan, and if there are certain goals that have been, or objectives that have been set, because people need to understand if they're coming into a certain institution, are there going to be parameters that I'm going to be evaluated on? Is it going to be part of my annual evaluation? Is it tied to my performance reviews? All of those things are becoming more and more common as we, again, intentionally not only just talk about DEI within our institutions, but really what I say, put your money where your mouth is and start to implement what it is, these statements that all these institutions rush to put in place. Now it's time to live up to them. So you should ask those types of questions, because I know as a DEI officer, I'm pushing my institution to do that type of very same thing. How do we hold everyone accountable?
We have, in our statement about everyone being valued, how is that materialized? Are you supporting and acknowledging the service longstanding service of employees, is that a regular thing? Is there data points on your website, information to know the different ethnic backgrounds of employees or students at the school? Is that data there? Are there initiatives in place that help support financially underrepresented groups, or traditionally underrepresented groups? What are the initiatives? What's the plan? And understand that plan is ever evolving. And so one of those check marks is every 3 years, 2 years, there's concrete places. Also, the leadership at the institutions, they should be speaking about their DEIB plans. It should be integral, not separate separate from the goals and the missions of that institution, regardless if it's a healthcare facility or a higher ed institution. What are their goals, and have that plain and transparent.
And I think we mentioned this, but we talked to, one of our questions was how you can recognize a healthy DEI environment. And I think that Dr. Hill-Butler, you've talked about, really taking a temperature of what's going on at the institution. Are they living their DEI statements? Who is achieving promotion and tenure? Who is rising up in the ranks of the institution? What is rewarded when it comes in terms of DEI at the institution? Do they have DEI policies to begin with? Any other insights related to how candidates can really recognize a healthy DEI environment, and maybe what a potentially how you could ask about that in an interview?
Yeah. So, hopefully, as we continue to recover from the COVID pandemic, a lot of people will be going back to in-person interviewing. But truth be told, a lot of interviewing now is being done like we're doing this. It's over a webinar. For my inaugural position here, my entire interview was done over Zoom. So I could not physically walk the Penn State campus to visually see, because even within a building, we let's talk about the I in DEI, the inclusion part. If I walk into a building and there's nothing that reflects an inclusive environment, from the artwork to the signage that's displayed, to how things are talked about, because there's one thing to say certain things, there's another thing to have it reflected in the environment in which you're actually going to be working. If I walk around and I don't see, for me, if I walk around and I don't see any other people of color, either in your staff, that actually sends a very clear message to me. And one of the other interesting things is, for a lot of these big land grant institutions like Penn State, we're Big Ten land grant. One of the questions I think people might even want to ask is, what is your institution's historical responsibility and awareness of land acknowledgement for Native Americans? Because I think it's important. One, it shows that you've done some research, and so you have some insight into the history. Two, you may be surprised by the answer. Because here at Penn State, up until last year, they couldn't even say that they had a statement of land acknowledgement because it was just put in place. And this university is hundreds of years old.
Right.
Yes, the same. Part of our DEIB statement was the land acknowledgement
As it should
to recognize. I mean, even the name of the city, Schenectady, is is a Native American term. So yes, acknowledging, and then now that we have a statement, is it spoken at convocations? Is it said at the beginning of programs? That hasn't happened yet. So part of a process. We're all evolving. It's taking benchmarks. So just being aware of those things, just the optics, who's on the campus. So if you can't go in person for an interview, look at the website and just see who's where, who's in which departments, where you know, what's the research, where people attend schools. That gives you some clues. But there have been studies that show that sometimes people of color are overrepresented on websites, on college websites. So now that there's been examinations of that, there were times here where I saw myself quite often on our college website, and I was like, that's changed a little bit now. It's just not me all the time. So there's other benchmarks there. But really studying the web pages and seeing, looking at their different media publications, and maybe following them on social media. What are they putting on social media? Certain departments. And what are they presenting? Who are they bringing in for speakers and as commencement speakers and those type of things? That shows the value of an institution and what they hold to be really important.
That's great. And I'm just so incredibly thankful to both of you today for being here and giving us your insights. You have a career of experience, lived experience, and are in institutional roles that really give us unparalleled insights into preparing for the job market. So we really appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. If we can move to the next slide. We'd really also like to, if you could proceed to the next slide as well. Really thank you for joining us today, and hope you've really taken away some key points for you and your own preparation on the job market. Like we've mentioned, the recording of the webinar will be archived on GSA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via this link. And in an effort for continual quality improvement, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the webinar, give us some feedback, and fill out the evaluation survey. That link will come to you following the completion of the webinar. So we highly encourage you to provide your feedback and any thoughts on future ESPO webinars that you're interested in. And if we can move to the following wrap-up slides, these are the additional peer-reviewed resources that some of our colleagues had shared with us a lot when we were sort of trying to gain insights into everyone's experiences and things that they found helpful. There's some recent commentaries in published peer-reviewed journals. Next slide. There's some additional original research articles that address DEI if you're interested in those. There's a few links. This is just a smattering of articles that you know, folks had recommended, but clearly this is not an exhaustive list. And moving forward, other literature, how to be an anti-racist, and so you want to talk about race. Also video content that may be helpful in your own personal reflections or may be useful for teaching strategies in your own classrooms. Next slide. And just some lay articles in the news and other web-based resources. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Hill Butler and Dr. Fields, for being here today. We really appreciate you, and thank you, ESPO members, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.